Hello and welcome again to Design Northeast. I'm John Devlin and I'm going to take you through this session on the National Design Guide and its contents. This is the fifth instalment of a training package on the National Design Guide. And these you will now be very familiar with are the objectives for this learning programme. Just to remind you that there are 7 parts to the delivery of this learning programme, and this is part 5, Components of the Built Environment. We're going to look at what makes up places, the components, and how these relate to the characteristics of well-designed places that we've previously discussed. The National Design Guide lists the 7 components of the built environment, and then goes on to say that good design is about making positive choices about all of them. The layout, scale, landscape, form, appearance, materials, and detailing of a development are all important and are all probably equally important. Layout. This is about how routes and blocks of development are arranged to create streets, open spaces and buildings. This applies at all scales from whole new settlements to the interior of a building. Layout influences how people move around and use the place, how people understand the place, how people feel about the place. It's often described as coarse grain, meaning big plots, big blocks, big spaces, often with little visual variation. Or fine grain, smaller subdivided plots, streets closer together, more intimate spaces and building frontages. On the left is a layout of Richmond, Yorkshire, which has been established over time, and you can see the very fine grain that's been naturally developed around the main marketplace. On the right is the layout of a proposed new housing development with random positioning of buildings, cul-de-sacs, and not necessarily a coherent layout in terms of navigation. Form. The three-dimensional shape of buildings and the spaces, including the size, shape and plan, height, bulk or volume, massing or shape, are what come together to create form. This influences how expensive, useful and maintainable and adaptable the buildings might be. It affects the visual identity of the place, how comfortable people feel going to it and through it. The picture on the left shows rural housing at Bunham Green, South Staffordshire, where size and shape of roofs, doors, porches, subdivisions are all part of an overall composition of form appropriate for the context. If you look at the diagrams on the right of the slide, these illustrate 3 differing solutions to producing exactly the same amount of density of development. The one on the top of the 3 diagrams is what you'd probably refer to as coarse grain. Large blocks, large spaces being created, almost something you'd expect to see in a city, and appropriate for a city perhaps. If you look at the lower diagram, that's a much finer grain, a seemingly more dense and intimate scheme, which would be more appropriate for residential areas and non-commercial areas. Looking at scale, the height, width and length of each building proposed within a development in relation to its surroundings is what creates the sense of scale. The scale of outdoor spaces, for example, street widths is also relevant. And this influences how visible and opposing buildings or spaces are, how practical and viable development is, and how intimidated or comfortable people feel when they're actually in those spaces and beside that scale of building. Scale can be experienced differently depending on the viewpoint. Ground floor windows and doors are experienced close up. Overall building height is seen from a distance. On the left is a street leading up from the Grassmarket in Edinburgh, and look at the contrast, the scale of the shop fronts to the building heights. The shop fronts are very small, intimate, following the grain of the buildings and allowing the development to curve around the corner to the next street, whereas the backdrop is of much larger scale buildings. So the two senses of scale come together and work well in this composition. The diagram on the right shows an important relationship between street width and scale. As the buildings are shorter, as in the lower diagram, and the narrower street width, there's more of a sense of enclosure. Once you look at the upper diagram and the buildings begin to move apart, then is the opportunity to maintain the sense of scale by having the subdivision of the boulevarded trees, redefining the space at ground level. There comes a point at which, when those buildings are sufficiently far apart, all sense of enclosure is lost, and there'll be a general feeling in the public's mind of space that is not comfortable to travel into or through. Appearance, the way a thing looks to other people. Aspects which determine the visual impression of a building or space include the architectural style, materials, decoration, lighting, colour and texture. Generally, this relates to the architectural approach used for the actual development itself. The appearance of outdoor spaces, for example, landscaping can be very relevant too. This influences how the buildings or spaces fit within their surroundings, how marketable a scheme which faces onto or as part of that space might be, and how people relate to the look of the place. Difficult to define is that level of comfort they have. Style is often linked to appearance, but a particular style does not mean the architecture will be good. The composition and texture of the building matter a lot. The picture on the left shows buildings that try to respond to the rhythm and material of their older neighbours, but don't reflect their style. Whilst the appearance of the rural homes on the right of the slide depend on the material scale, form and detailing and their relationship to the landscape. Landscape. All the visible features of an area of land. The treatment of land, other than buildings, including landform and drainage, surfacing, boundary treatment, street furniture, play equipment, trees, shrubs and other planting, all contribute to the character and sense of place of a development. The landscape details might include the use of water, light and foliage to create and further enhance the sense of place as an integrated scheme. On the left, we see a scheme where the landscape has been a key element of its identity, which has been developed out of the necessity of having a SUDS system. So that's been turned to advantage to turn it into something which is a worthwhile buffer and space in its own right. On the right, a more conventional approach, simpler, but the landscape's no less important for the people who live there. The opportunity was there and has been taken and used successfully. The building, its glazing and hard landscaping materials used to construct the building or space all affect the character. Some materials are invisible, but influence how buildings and spaces perform and how well they last, how much heating they need, and how safe they are. Other materials are visible and make contact with the users day to day, such as street surfaces, external walls, ironmongery. These have influences. The embodied and day-to-day energy costs of the development are affected by them. How well the place will last and how easy it will be to maintain are determined by them. How people respond to the texture, tone and feel of the place also is an influence. Do they respect it? Do they look after it? Do they enjoy it? Do they understand it? These pictures show the variety of materials used in two very different London streets, looking at the floor surfaces and how they've been treated, how the importance of the surface running straight up to the front of the buildings on the illustration on the right makes sense, with small areas of defensible space being defined by the planters. And finally, detailing. The details of a building are the individual components and how they are put together. These are usually associated with the architectural elements of the building, such as windowsills, arches, door frames, and such like. Landscaping details might include the use of the water, light, and foliage to create atmosphere, space, and define areas. They also have influences. How rich and visually interesting the place is, how much time and effort has been put into the design is demonstrated by the detailing of the building and the thoughtfulness of the detailing and the cleverness indeed of the detailing. How valued people using the place might feel. Somebody's actually cared to spend the time and effort and energy and money detailing the place properly. On the left, it is an example of detail required as part of a planning application to ensure a high standard of design quality is achieved. On the right, an illustration of how the depth of window reveals can make a big difference to the appearance of facade. When the glass is very close to the outer edge of the wall, it feels almost like the architecture is a simple plane. It could blow away in the wind. Weight, visual weight, and gravitas is given to the facade by recessing the window from the outer wall plane and makes the building look and feel heavier and more robust. Simple to do, not always thought about, but the difference it makes is significant. All 7 of these identified components require positive, thoughtful choices to be made to achieve a well-designed development. It's not a lot, only 7 items, but the collective impact of good choices in those 7 items is immense. It's the difference between poor or average and excellence. Thanks for taking the time to engage with this presentation. The next session, Part 6, will be delivered by my colleague, Chris Gill. Thank you. Goodbye.